Okay, I believe we've just started going live. So, welcome to everyone who is joining us today. Before we get into today's session, I'd like to welcome you to check in for today's event. So, check in information is on the screen in front of you. And once you check in, it will give you access to lots of resources and information about upcoming sessions across all reactors, which are around similar topics to today. So please do feel free to check in for today. So, today's session is number 2 out of this series. So, we are looking at Azure DevOps for continuous integration and continuous delivery. Today's session will run over the next 60 minutes. Any questions that you do have, feel free to put them into the comments section. We'll be moderating that throughout, getting back to those questions as soon as we can. So, please do feel free to get involved as much as possible today. We are also recording today's session and we'll make it available for everyone to watch on demand. That will go onto the Microsoft Reactor YouTube channel, and I will share that link with you in the next few minutes as well. So to briefly talk through our code of conduct. So this is just a reminder to everyone who is with us today to be aware of one another, friendly and welcoming to everyone who's on today's call, and just understanding of differences that we might see throughout any Q&A or conversation that might happen today. So we're welcoming back Brian Benz, who is delivering today's talk. Brian is a cloud advocate at Microsoft. So Brian, delighted to have you back again, and I'll hand over to you to get us started today.
Thank you. Yeah, great to be back. Today's session is part 2 of a series. So there's going to be another session next week on GitHub. Today's session is going to be all about Azure DevOps. And I'm going to show you how to take an application from GitHub, make some changes to it on your local machine. That's going to be pushed up to GitHub. Then from GitHub, it's going to trigger a build and a release on Azure DevOps, which is going to deploy to a web app. And I'll get started with that. I'm just going to give a brief intro. I did give this in the last I gave a more detailed explanation of what is DevOps and the intro to DevOps in the last part of this series. Hopefully we can put that video link on the screen there. But for now, I'm just going to give you a really brief overview of what is DevOps and a few other things, including what is DevOps, people, process, and products, keep your investments, and DevOps in action. So the first thing I want to just say is, in terms of what is DevOps, it's the unit of people, process, and products to deliver a value to your end users. This is a quote from a colleague of mine, Donovan Brown, and it's a great, succinct way of describing what DevOps is. Really, all 3 of those components are extremely valuable. Also, value is not to be overlooked. If you're not delivering value through your DevOps process, which does take some investment, then it's really not worth it. So you need a system where people understand their roles and they're all working together in collaboration. And then you have a process which is clear and easy to understand. Everybody understands their roles in that process. And then you have to have products to enable continuous delivery. I'm going to cover all the 3 of those today. Specifically, we're going to talk about Azure DevOps. So here's an example of the people, process, and products sharing the load. The dev team might do something like, of course, they're going to provide code, but they might also provide the code repo, or they might have a repo provided from the ops team. And then they do some unit testing, and they have some CI/CD automation contributions because they know what the code is. On the ops side, you've got the DevOps tools and services that they manage. You've got some CI/CD automation that covers the ops part of that, and they understand that part. Runtime platform, they control what runtime platform is on their runtime servers, and that's because they have to be able to control security, scaling, and monitoring for that. So it's very important that the 2 dev and ops teams have everything working in concert when you work with a DevOps system, just to make sure everything's going to run smoothly. The reason why I want to show you this is I'm going to call back to this slide a couple of times during my demos and say, okay, this is where the dev team works, and this is where they hand it off to the ops team and stuff. So it'll be more clear as we go through what the roles are for everybody in the process using the products, which in this case is Azure DevOps. So there's a few things we use. We use Azure DevOps pipelines. The pipelines have a build pipeline and a release pipeline. We're going to focus on those today. But in addition to that, Azure also has Kanban boards, which is the Azure Boards feature. It's pretty cool. We use it daily to actually deliver videos like this. We also have repos. So the repos themselves are similar to GitHub repos, but they have a few additional features. They're integrated into your identity management, whatever that may be at your organization. Also, they handle TFVC, Team Foundation Version Control. So if you're using a Team Foundation Server, TFS, it's something that might be of interest to you. We also have Azure Artifacts. Azure Artifacts is a way to control and manage your artifacts that are used as part of builds. That could be Node or Maven or any artifact manager. You can keep those and keep different versions of those for auditing and for rollback purposes. It's pretty cool stuff. Also, Azure Test Plans are a way to test out websites, test loads, and other things. On the other side of things, we have the GitHub. It's not really another side. It's really just the same, but in addition, we have GitHub, which is a few different things. GitHub Actions, we have extensions, and I'll explain what the difference is those in a little bit when I show you an extension in action. Extension in action, that's not confusing, huh? Okay, it's early for me over here. I'm in Las Vegas, anyway. So integration with Azure and other clouds is something that it's really good for GitHub. You're able to integrate not just with Azure, but there's some third-party extensions and actions that you can use to deploy to our competitors if you need to in a multi-cloud situation. We also have integration with popular IDEs, including Visual Studio Code, which I'm going to show you, and we have free. One thing I want to call out that people might not be aware of is since Microsoft bought GitHub, we have free private repos for individuals and teams. It used to be you would have to pay for private repos of any kind. They were free if you kept them public, but the private repos were paid. In this case, free private repos are not just free for individuals, they're also free for teams to a certain size. So check that out. All right, now extensions, I mentioned that. So GitHub Actions are self-written scripts that you use to do certain actions like deployments or testing or a lot of different things. There is a marketplace you can go to for GitHub Actions, the GitHub Actions marketplace. You can just search that and you can find all kinds of pre-built actions. They run on top of something called a runner in GitHub, and they actually just perform different tests based on the script that you run. GitHub extensions, by contrast, are written by third parties, and they're provided to GitHub, and they are used for integration into specific scenarios. In this case, we're going to use the Microsoft Azure Pipeline extension, which allows us to connect to GitHub and Azure DevOps. We're also going to use Visual Studio Code for this demo. So Visual Studio Code is a open source text editor, and it's got a ton of extensions. We're going to be using the Java extensions today. It has Git commands built in, which I'm going to show a bit of. It has IntelliSense, and as I mentioned before, it's free and it's open source. You can find it on GitHub. They take pull requests, and you can log issues there as well. So it's a full open source project. All right, so that's it. That's all the slides for today. We're going to go dive into the demos. So let me show you what I have here. This is my dashboard. So inside my dashboard, when you work with Azure DevOps or Azure in general, The first thing you're going to have is you're going to have an Azure account, and you can get a free trial. You can just search for Azure free trial if you don't have one already. But inside of Azure, you have a portal. And inside that portal, I organize things with custom dashboards. Here's my custom dashboards. I organize them by presentations because that's what I do, but you can organize them by tasks. You can have North American operations, European operations, et cetera, et cetera. You can organize different things and create different dashboards for different tasks. This particular one, I've got some items that we're going to use here for our demos today. And over here on the right, I've got some links that I use for finding things. This is a Markdown plugin that you can use when you edit your dashboards. So I find this extremely useful. This is a resource group. This on the left here is what we call DevOps for Java Shop's resource group. And this is a way of organizing resources into a useful container. It's not a Docker container. It's just a container for storing all the resources in one place and sort of a logical grouping of objects that you have in Azure. In this case, we've got a few different things. We've got several app services. Java Shop Production is my production server that I use for running the application. Staging is my staging server. And then I've got another one called GitHub, and we're going to use that one in next Tuesday's session. That is working with GitHub Actions. I've got a app service deployment slot, which would be used for A/B testing. And this is the app service plan that actually controls the production, the staging, and the GitHub. And what happens here is the app service plan actually controls your size of apps inside of that app service and the costs and things like that. It's all related. So you can scale up and scale down all of the applications in your app service plan by accessing the service plan. And then these three app services will be affected when I do that.
So I'm actually going to begin at the ending today, and I'm going to show you the end result that we're going to get to. And then what we're going to do is we're going to go through and we're going to build the app from scratch through GitHub, all the way through Azure DevOps, through a build and a release. And then we're going to end up actually back where we started here at this production application that I want to show you today. All right, so if I click on this link, this is the production web app that we've built. You get this nice little white label error page because we're not at the main starting point. This is the app. Couldn't be more simple. It's a Spring app. It's a Java application that basically just has a menu. But it is connected to a feature flag via something we call the Azure App Config Manager. So let's go in and I'll show you what this actually does. So here's the application in its natural state. And what I've got is I've got a feature flag that basically triggers a new feature that will activate when I turn on the feature flag. So let's go back to our dashboard. And let's go to Feature Manager, which is our Azure App Configuration service. When I click on Feature Manager, there's a couple of different options here. I'm going to turn on the beta feature, so it updates a feature flag. Now, this could be any application across Azure as long as it's accessible to this application. But in this case, what I just did is I turned this on. Now I'm going to refresh it a couple of times. And you'll see, hopefully, there we go. You'll see this nice, wonderful new feature, which is a picture of Bit, our developer advocate mascot. And the reason I want to show you is just to illustrate how you actually make feature managers work in Azure. So you have this tool called Feature Manager, which is an Azure App Configuration service. And you can turn on and off the features through this. So the idea here is a really simple example. The idea here would be that you have a new feature you want to try out. You can literally just turn it on by going into Feature Manager. And if the feature doesn't work out, you can just turn it off again. You can also set up percentages. So percentages will actually control things like if I go in here, you can see some JSON that actually controls this. So it says half the people who go to this particular feature are going to see the old feature, half the people are going to see the new feature. But that's the idea behind feature flags. And there's a few other configurations here, but that's not what this session is all about today. This is just something we're going to be using to activate what we call an A/B test. So figuring out if users want a new feature or an old feature using a Azure DevOps and something called deployment slots as our main configuration for this. So let's go back to the dashboard. Okay, so how do we actually get here? Well, I wanted to tell you as well that all of the steps that I'm going to follow today are in a GitHub repo that I put together called DevOps for Java Shops, and we'll put the link in the show page for that. But there's different steps we're going through, and today we're actually going through exercise 4. We're going to go through exercise 4 and 5, which is Azure DevOps for CI and CD. So continuous integration, continuous deployment is where we're going to go today. And then we've got some A/B testing we're going to do as well. And the next series, the next episode in this series covers DevOps with GitHub, which we'll cover in a subsequent episode. All right, so for now, let's get going with this. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to use this repo called DevOps for Java Shops, test AB Azure DevOps. And if you want to follow along at home, all you need to do is fork this. So you can fork it to your own repo and then clone it to your local machine as well. And actually all the steps to do that, once again, are in the DevOps for Java Shops repo. Setting up all the apps and everything we need as targets for this are there as well. But let's get started. So what we're going to do is we're going to use this DevOps for Java Shops test AB Azure DevOps. This is the code that I showed you here. This is actually the code that works with this. So that's the original code in its original state without the feature flag enabled. And this is what you get at the end. And that is in this repo. So the first thing we want to do is we actually want to set up a brand new Azure DevOps project. We're going to set up a brand new Azure DevOps organization and project to make this work. So to do that, we need to connect this GitHub repo with Azure DevOps. And to do that, if I click here on Marketplace and I search for Azure Pipelines, so Azure Pipelines is actually an app. It's a GitHub extension as opposed to a GitHub action. So we have an Azure Pipelines action down here, and this actually connects GitHub to Azure Pipelines. But that's not what we want to do today. What we want to do using an action. And what we want to do is we want to use the extension that Microsoft actually wrote. So the difference here, real quick, is Azure GitHub extensions are written by third parties. They can be open source or not, and basically they're a way of connecting GitHub to third-party applications, services, clouds in this case. GitHub Actions are scripts that are written. They are run on top of these things called runners, and they basically manage all kinds of different functionality, but they're not necessarily there for connection to something. They do CI/CD fairly well, but there's a few things we want to do that GitHub Actions don't do yet. Like we want to have some manual approvals in our deployment process, and we want to have a multi-stage deployment where some tests are done in between stages. So you'll have a staging, and then you're going to have some A/B testing, and then you move things to production. That's something that's better handled by Azure Pipelines at this moment, so that's what we're going to do. So we're going to use the Azure Pipelines extension. We're going to click there. And I've already installed it. It says here, GitHub is already, you already have purchased this app on the GitHub Marketplace. It's free, but that's what it tells you. So that means that you've already downloaded it and configured it. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to configure access to this. And I click on Azure Pipelines. Now I have to get my GitHub ID. Once I've entered my GitHub ID, it automatically takes me to this page, which, let me just zoom out a little bit there. There we go. Which has some permissions here and a little bit of a description of what this extension does. But I'm going to explain what it does. So We'll just skip ahead. So I can choose to have this particular extension triggered by all repositories, which would be really bad. That would mean that Azure DevOps does different things depending on what happens in all of my repositories. And I've got 100 repositories. I don't want that to happen. So we do it on select repositories. In this case, we want to do it on DevOps for Java Shops, test AB Azure DevOps. All right, so let's save that. What that's going to do is now we're leaving GitHub and we're actually going to enter Azure DevOps. When we go into Azure DevOps, we click on my Microsoft credentials. And it's going to take me to Azure Pipelines. So Azure Pipelines, what I want to do here, as I mentioned before, so what we're doing is we're going to integrate GitHub with Azure DevOps. Every time something happens in GitHub, we want it to trigger a Azure DevOps build and a release. But then we don't want it to release all the way out to Azure. We're going to have some manual processes to actually review and approve a deployment out to production. So let's go here and let's create a new organization. We're going to call this one dev.azure.com Reactor Day 2. Okay, gotta spell that right. Reactor Day 2, and we're going to host in Central US. Looks good. Do they have West US too? They do. Okay, we'll go for West US too because it's a little closer to where I am. And the product visibility, we're going to make it private, which means that it's just available to me. I can also make it available to anybody in my enterprise or public. But let's just make it private for now. And then we're going to do the CAPTCHA. All right, so now what it's going to do is going to take me to my DevOps organization, and it's going to analyze the code that is in that repo. That's the first thing it's going to do. Oh, wait, actually, I got to authenticate one more time just to allow my credentials on GitHub to work with Azure DevOps. This may or may not be something you see in your organization depending on your security setup. Okay, so we select a repository. In this case, so now we're in Azure DevOps. You see over on the left here, all the things I described in the slides. But we want, now Azure DevOps is asking, okay, so you told GitHub what you want to do over here, but you haven't told Azure DevOps what you want to connect to yet. And what this does is actually behind the scenes sets up a webhook so that anytime there is a push to this repo, it's going to trigger a pipeline, which does a build, and then a release pipeline, which does a release. Let's click on that. It's going to check the permissions, and then it's going to do some pipeline YAML. So the pipeline YAML here actually analyzes the application and decides what it wants to do. This is just a generic. It's figured out that there's a Java project, and it's given us a few basic things with a Java project. It's going to use a POM XML to actually do a build, but there's a couple extra things we want to do. And this is a good example of dev and ops working together. So if I go back into my, repo in GitHub, you'll see that I've been provided with an Azure pipeline that I can use. And in this case, provided Azure Pipeline YAML here is the file we want because it's just got a couple extra steps here. Now you might have, the ops team providing these and saying, okay, this is the minimum viable YAML script that we want to use for all deployments to our app services on Azure. And the reason why we give you this is because there's some minimum security things that we need to do. There's some checking we need to do and a few other things. But in reality, all this does is add a little artifact drop here that makes it easier to do the repo. So let's go back to our pipeline. And instead of using the code that Azure DevOps came with to do this, we're going to use this code. There's one more step before we actually do the run. Because if you remember, we're using Feature Manager, there's a connection between this app and Feature Manager. And what this is going to do, it's actually going to build it. It's going to take something called a hosted agent on Azure, and it's going to run this and it's going to build it. And if it can't build completely, it will not allow us to do a release. because we don't want non-working code to be released out into our resources on Azure. So the first thing we want to do is we want to connect our Azure application configuration service with this application. To do that, you set up a variable. So we're going to have a new variable, and let me get that variable for you. Variable is called app configuration connection string, and the value we're going to put in, I'm not going to tell you. All right. And you keep this value secret. That means that if you use a secret variable in a script, you must explicitly map it as an environment variable. Yeah, for this one we won't actually, but in general you want to do that. It keeps things encrypted at rest anyway, but for this, let's just save it like that. Okay, so we've got our variable in there. Now we've got our app configuration connection string. Oh, and I've got it. You know what? It's good I didn't make it a secret because there is definitely, oh no, okay. Never mind. See that equals there? It threw me off. I don't know why it's there, but anyway, it's there now. So this should run. So what we want to do now is we want to run this. We're going to save it and we're going to run it. And basically what it should do, it's going to create a hosted pipeline, and it's going to create a hosted agent that this can actually run on in a build. Okay, so it checked everything out. It looks like it's going to run, so it's actually started running. And here's our run that works here. Oops. Okay. Oh, jobs down here. Clicked in the wrong place. So what it does, it's going to check this out. It's going to check it out from GitHub, from the repo that we've connected. It's going to run some Maven. This actually takes quite a while to run the Maven. And then it runs on these things called hosted agents. So while it's running, let me show you what that is. Microsoft hosted agents. I did put a link to them somewhere here. MS hosted agents. There we go. So in the docs, it describes to you what a hosted agent is. And basically, this is a virtual machine that you can use. You borrow it. It actually runs a build, and it has several different environments you can use. So Windows Server 2019, Windows Server 2016, Ubuntu 20, 18, and 16, and Mac OS X, Mojave and Catalina. These are the hosted agents you can use. If I click on Windows Server 2019, it'll drill down and it'll tell me all of the software that actually is pre-installed on this hosted agent I can use. Now, if you need to add a piece of software that isn't here, as you can see, the list is pretty extensive. You can actually add that through some commands in your YAML file as well. But let's go back to our pipeline and see how we're doing. Okay, good. So we've checked it out. We've run the Maven package. It's published the pipeline. It's finalizing the job. And it's basically 100% one artifact produced and 100% tests passed. That's great news. Okay, so let's go back to this now. And what we can do now is we can actually create a release. So take note of this job here, 2021-05-25. So this is the job we want to use. And what we're going to do now is we're going to go into releases. So this was a successful job. It ran. Now we need to create a release. Remember, we created a brand new project here, so there's nothing here yet except that one build and that one artifact that's sitting there waiting. So the next thing we want to do is a release. So create a new release. Okay, and we're going to deploy a Java app to an Azure App Service. There's different templates, as you can see, that you can use, and this one we're going to call staging. So we've got an artifact and we've got staging. So let's add our artifact. There's different ways you could add artifact. You can go from Jenkins. I mentioned before about investment. You can go from Azure repos, GitHub, directly from GitHub. But in this case, we're going to go from an actual build that was in Azure DevOps Pipelines. So the project, there's the source build. The default version could be latest. You can also you can specify a release at the time of the release creation. You can do the latest from a build branch with tags, from a specific branch with tags, a specific version, but we're just going to go latest because we only have one version anyway. But in the future, we want it to always pick up the latest version. So we go add. Now, if I want to do continuous deployment, I go here, enable continuous deployment. I can also do a pull request trigger. Instead of just a release and a successful build, it's going to be anything that comes through a pull request, but we don't want to do that right now. So this is now continuous deployment. As soon as there is a successful build of the latest version of this, so any new version of this, it's going to trigger this job. So what does the job do? Let's go into staging and let's look at what the job does. In this case, there are some staging tasks that we need to take care of. Let's click on the one job and two tasks. See those little exclamation mark to tell us there's a few things we need to do. And we're going to choose my subscription. And what this does is create a connection between Azure DevOps and an app service or other things in Azure that I'm going to need for this particular deployment. Okay, what's that? Once that's done, then I've got some pre-made apps that I want to use for this. Web apps for Linux. And here they are. This is the Java Shop staging server. It's an app server, and there's a startup command I want to use, which I will paste in. So Java jar home site. This is the actual location of the file we want to use. And that is essentially what we want to do. Now we want to drill down into this deploy war to Azure App Service. And we're actually going to call it, even though we say deploy war to Azure App Service, it's going to be a jar file. Okay, and the runtime stack we're going to use is Java SE11. That's the startup command. There are also some application and configuration settings we can do. I can actually set up the configuration string that we need. Remember, we need to connect to the feature manager. But in this case, we're not going to do that. I've already set it up in the app, and I'll show you that in a minute. But once that's done, then we can actually save this and deploy it. So save, OK. All right, so what we're going to do now is we're going to create a release. If I create a release here, let's make sure I did everything. Yeah, everything's done. So if I go create release here, it's just going to go to staging for now. And let's see what that looks like. So basically, it's going to get the latest version of the app. We're going to skip over learning what's new. I like this new graphic interface, but there is a way to do this completely with YAML. If you like that, but I like for demos to do this, and you can extract YAML from here when you're done. But I like to have the nice graphic layout just to give everybody a good picture of what's happening here. Okay, so while this is deploying, it's going to go through, it's going to deploy a bunch of stuff in staging. It went and got the application, and it's going to do a commit, it's going to do a change, it's going to use those commands that I used and deploy it out to Azure. Let's go back to our dashboard while that's running. So back to the Azure portal, and let's look at our Java Shop staging web app. Okay, so what I've done in here, if I go into configuration, this is just staging.azurewebsites.net. If I go into configuration, I mentioned that you have to connect the feature flag. So in application settings, not connection strings, in application settings, you go in and you set up that app configuration connection string, just like we did with the variables to allow it to build in the Azure Pipelines. You do the same thing here in the app. Now, as I showed you before in the Azure DevOps, there's a way you can actually configure this. If it changes all the time or something, you can configure this in your Azure DevOps job as well. Or you're deploying to new pristine web apps that might not have this configured. But this is another example of dev and ops working together. So it's a great example of doing that, where the ops team will provide the app service that you need. They'll configure it the way you need it to run using the configuration and the connection string. And the dev team would put together that pipeline that allows it to deploy out to this app. But everybody knows their job. Everybody knows, the ops team knows they have to set up configuration for the server. The dev team knows they have to set up the pipelines to do the builds and releases. All right, so let's go back. That's the only thing I had to configure in this particular application to make this work. Let's go back to our release and see what happened. Okay, so it ran on release 1, deployment succeeded, and I can actually look at the logs here. And I can see it deployed, that job where it says deploy war to Azure App Service. And here's the actual link to the application. So if I click on this, this is the staging app. And I get that nice little white label error page because we know that that doesn't work, but there it is. Okay, so the welcome is there. Now we know we set up the configuration for the feature flag, so I can turn on that feature flag, and it's going to turn it on here too. But I want to do something a little bit different here. The next thing I want to do, if we go back to Azure DevOps, close that. So we also want to put this into production. So to do that, let's go to our releases. And let's go to edit. Okay, so we've got our staging server here. I'm going to clone this, and that's going to move it. Now I want to move it to production. So instead of staging, we're going to call this production. Okay. And if I go into the one job, two tasks, web apps for Linux, I literally just choose a drop down here. Everything else stays the same. Save, okay. Back to our pipeline. So now we got staging and production, but we don't want things just to fly into from staging to production. So let's actually set up an approval. In this case, we're setting up a post-deployment approval. And this is one of the nice things about Azure DevOps is it's integrated with your identity management system for your application because it's part of Azure. So my name is in there, and I'm going to be approving this. There's also some other things you can do. I'll cover those in a minute. But this is a post-deployment approval. So the idea here is you move your artifacts to staging, you do some things in staging, maybe you have another test server as well, but you want to try out a few things, a few unit tests, maybe some integration testing here, make sure everything works, and then you want to move it to production. But the production team wants to have control over when it actually goes into production. I think that's a pretty reasonable request. So once again, you can have one person who's in charge of saying, it's done with staging, and then you have another person who says, okay, now it's okay to do it into production. So this could be staging on a Wednesday afternoon, and this could be a Friday night, because the people who put it in production on Friday night aren't developers, and they don't know any better. But they would put that in on whenever they need it to go in, according to their schedule, so the production doesn't get disrupted with a new version of this thing that goes out. I save it, make sure and save it. Okay, so the whole save is there. Now I can do a create release, and basically what it's going to do now is it's going to ask me to go through, and when it gets to here, it's going to ask me for a manual approval. It'll send it by email, and it'll also just prompt me here as well. Now, we could finish there. We can go staging. We get a nice approval process to production. But I mentioned we want to do an A/B test. So an A/B test would basically allow some of the people to see the version that we have, and some of the people to use the older version of the site that we're building. To do that, I can clone this again. And in this time, I can change this, and I can call this Canary. So Canary deployments are where you're going to try a new feature, but you can roll it back if you want to, versus A/B testing where you're going to do one feature and another feature. It's kind of combining the two of them here. We can actually put this into production. If they like it, great. We'll put it into production. We'll put it into a half of the people who see this in production. If they like it, we're going to watch their behavior. If they like it, if the feature works as intended and the behavior works as intended of the users, and everybody's happy with it, then we'll put it into production. So let's just change this to production again. And to do this, we're using something called a deployment slot, which I will explain in a minute. But to go into Canary, we're actually still going to go into the production web server, but we're going to go to this thing called a deployment slot. A deployment slot here is going to be production, DevOps for Java shops. Let's see, it's still in production. We want to put it in Canary, and I'll explain all of that. Will be clear in a couple of minutes here. So let's go in and let's look at our pipeline now. Everything's saved. So now we have a 3-stage pipeline. We have staging, and then we're going to do a pre-deployment approval to Canary, and then we got another pre-deployment approval to production. So that's pretty cool. Let's start this off. Let's create a release, and let's see what it does. So release 2 has been created. As you can see, it's queued, it's waiting. So while that's waiting, let's explain what deployment slots are. Let's go back to our Java shop web app, but in this time, we're going to go into production. So there's different things you can do with these things called deployment slots. This is our web app deployment slots. In this case, Java shop production and Java production Canary, I can actually change these. Right now, all of the traffic is going to the production version of this website. But if I want, I can set it up so 50% of the traffic goes to one version of the website and 50% of the traffic goes to the other version of the website. So I can use Feature Manager or turn on the feature, but it's only going to be on the staging server and in this deployment slot. It won't be in the final production server yet. That means half the people will see the old site, half the people will see the new site using an app service. And the reason why you want to do this, now Feature Manager, I showed you before, has a 50-50 version as well, right? So you could watch and see what people do with that, but that doesn't have a couple of things you need. In this case, sticky sessions. So for example, you might have a situation where somebody's coming in and looking at the Tailwind Traders website, and not the Tailwind Traders website, the website that we've got here for this feature, they want to stay on that one version of the website for the entire visit, for their entire session. They don't want to see another version of the website when they refresh the page. And that's what this deployment slot does. It has sticky sessions, so it makes people go to one version of the website and they stay there, versus the Feature Manager, which has a variable result depending on how many times you refresh the page. Okay, so we've got the Java Shop production, Java Shop Canary. Let's go here. This is what the Canary, so the URL, let me back up actually, Java Shop production. If I go to the overview here, you see this URL is javashopproduction.azurewebsites.net. Okay, that's where the actual end result of that website goes. If I go to my deployment slots, behind the scenes, this one's called JavaShop Production-Canary.azurewebsites.net. So it's a slightly different version of the website itself. And what that does, there's an internal router basically that's going to send 50% of the people there. I can go in and I could look I could actually adjust this. So I could say, okay, looks like people are pretty happy with the 50%. Let's increase this to 70%. So I can have only 30% of the people doing production, and then Canary. Then you can go up here and you can swap these deployment slots. So it would actually swap production with Canary, and all of a sudden you're in production. Or in this case, you want to be able to roll back using Azure DevOps. So you want to be able to move from there. Okay, so staging is here. This is what an approval looks like. And I just say, sure, approve. So it's a nice little graphical interface here. And what it's going to do now, this is Canary, so we're moving into the production server. No user would see this in staging, so the dev team can actually approve this. But when you're moving into Canary, some of the people, 50%, are going to be able to see this in production. So you want the ops team to be able to approve this. That's why you do the pre-deployment approval. And if you notice here, you can click on defer deployment for later, which you can't do with a post-deployment approval. And that will automatically allow this to go. So yeah, so let's go. So while that's deploying, let me just give that a second. And I will explain a little bit about some other things you can do with those gates. So if I click here again, whoops, let's go back to the actual editing of the not the release. Hold on, mouse click malfunction. I'm blaming the equipment. That's right. Anyway, so I go to Canary here. I'm going to click on pre-deployment conditions, and we're in the edit now. So there's these things called triggers, and these things called gates. So triggers will allow you to do things like set up schedules, deployments, but gates are a little even more interesting here. Gates allow you to, if you enable them, there's several things you can do with gates to it's not showing here right now, but there's several things you can do here, like make an API call, check for some software. So you might have, for example, oh, there we go. So you can check Azure policy compliance. You can evoke an Azure functions. You can evoke a REST API, query Azure monitor alerts, and query work items. And the work items are in your Azure DevOps board, which I didn't cover here. Is a totally different topic. But basically what this allows you to do, for example, if you have a third-party tool that checks for compliance with open source modules or software, you can invoke a REST API to that tool, and that tool can return a score or a yay or nay and allow you to continue from there. I don't want to change anything right now, so let's just do that. Let's go into our release 2. And you can see it succeeded going to Canary. And now if I want to move this to production, I can actually approve this. And I can defer the deployment to later, but I'm just going to say approve. And it's actually going to go out and approve. It's actually going to go out and deploy that based on my approval and do that. But as I mentioned before, you can also do automatic approvals through staging or Canary or any of those others as well. So that's just a quick recap of how that works. If I look at the logs here, for example, while that's running, let's see here. So deploy war to Azure App Services time. I mentioned before Java Shop production canary.azurewebsites.net. Let's go and have a look at that. So this is the Canary deployment. Oops. Looks like an application error. You know why? And I know why. Because when you set up production, I made a mistake here, and this is going, I'd have to deploy it again, but I'll show you what happened. This is good real world stuff. So if I look at my configuration, I didn't do one thing. So if you see the application settings here, you'll notice that there's no application setting for this particular application. So let's go ahead and do that. App configuration connection string. value, because the deployment slot is like its own production instance. So you do need to create, even though there's one in production already, you do need to create this when you do that. And it's going to save it. And it's actually going to reset that server. So it's going to, I don't know if this is going to screw up the deployment, which is deploying right now to this server at the same time. Let's see. Yeah, it's not going to work unless I deploy it again. But let's go back to our DevOps release. It should have at least gone into production. All right. So production succeeded. Let's hope that one didn't get screwed up by my restart of the application. Okay, here we are. That's Canary. Haha, it didn't. So only I would have to set up, there we go. So it's working in production, but it didn't work in the Canary. And that's because I didn't have the app connection string, the app configuration string set up in there before I deployed to the deployment slot. So production works because it already has that set up. But when I changed it after the fact in the deployment slot, it's not going to work. So I would have to run this deployment again. In the interest of time, I won't do that. But you get the idea here. There's some configuration you need to do. And this is a great example of the dev and the ops team working together. So the ops team, me, let down the dev team by not having that configuration string set up in the deployment slot the way it should be, only in production. Anyway, so let's go back in for the final part of this demo. I turn on the feature manager. And in this case, turn on my beta string. So there you go. There you go. So that's the new feature with bits sitting there. Now, if it went into production, the way it would work here is, and this is a good example. So these, as you can see, the Canary and the production are very different websites. So right now, if we had this set up in production for real, some users would be getting a blank screen and an error message, and some users would be getting this. So obviously, the blank screen would be generating some undesired behavior, and we'd want to roll that back to the previous version and make sure that we did that. But that's, in a sense, everything that needs to be done, and that is exactly how the pipeline works. So you can see here, we got an artifact. So anytime there's a change now in that GitHub repo, it was going to go through staging, then we approve it to go to Canary. Somebody has to approve it to go to Canary, actually. Once it's in Canary, then you can do your A/B testing with this Canary instance. And then, assuming everything's okay, you move it to production. So that's everything. That's the whole demo, as it were. And let's take it back.
Hi, Brian. Still here. Yeah, haven't left you. Yeah, so we're just about on time. So, Brian, thanks for such a great session again. And I mean, your Twitter handle's on the screen. So I guess if people do want to reach out with follow-up questions, is that the best place for them to reach you?
Yeah, that is. Let me just put that up there. So yeah, you can look at bbens. Yeah, you can reach out to me. So that's basically what we did is we did a deployment from from GitHub. We deployed out to a build, and then we did a release pipeline. And the next session we're going to do is GitHub. So it's going to use GitHub to do pretty much the same thing with the feature flags activated as well. So yeah.
Great stuff. Looking forward to it. So same time again next week. Hope to see everyone back again. And this session will be available, like I said in the beginning, available to watch on demand. So I shared the link just at the beginning of the session where you can access that shortly. And lastly, we do have a survey for this session. I posted the link and event code in the chat. So any feedback is really appreciated. So please do send yours through. But we'll wrap it up there for today. Brian, thanks so much again. And thank you
Yeah.
everyone for attending, and see you back again next week.
Thanks, everybody.